What's up guys, my name is Josh, and today we're going to be talking about the Massdrop plus universal IEMs. And before we get into that, I do want to mention really quick that this video should be a little bit better, well, not a little bit better, quite a bit better quality than all of my previous videos, simply because I actually changed the body on which I shoot. So I'll put in some footage now of the old camera. As you can see, comparatively, it's quite a bit blurrier and doesn't have quite the level of detail that this camera has. So I'm hoping that the change will maybe not matter to everybody, but some of you may notice and appreciate it. And I'm still a little nervous using this camera because the autofocus isn't nearly as good. And since you probably don't really care about that, let's go ahead and talk about the Plus Universal IEM from Massdrop. I do want to let you know that Massdrop did send me this item for free. It is mine to do with what I choose. They did not ask, pay, or otherwise try and influence me to say anything good or bad about this headphone. So all opinions on this topic are my own. This item is kind of an interesting item to me because Massdrop has generally kind of gone towards the more budget-friendly option. They made the 650s cheaper, they made the K702s cheaper, and generally for their headphones, they really try and fit into a budget market. And I find this very, very interesting because these come in about $300. And for a Massdrop item that they're making and they're selling and is solely a Massdrop item, it's not an affiliation with like Sennheiser or AKG like some of their other headphones are, that's a pretty high price. And I find that very interesting, simply because if they're gonna list them at $300, then they must be fairly critical of the way they sound. I think that I should be critical of the way they sound too. So without beating around the bush anymore, let's go ahead and jump into the review, starting with sound. What are the general impressions of what this sounds like? These are a smooth and enjoyable sound and slightly mid-range focused. Now, they're kind of interesting, and I'm actually gonna start off the sound category in reverse. Normally I do treble all the way down to bass. Today I'm actually gonna start with the bass response because I found this particular area kind of intriguing. Now the bass response on these does go very, very low. I was starting to kind of experience a little bit of roll off around 35 to 40 hertz, which is fairly low. I do think that they are a little bit bass boosted compared to what I would consider to be, perfectly flat and neutral across the board. And I don't have any sort of frequency response graphs to back up what I am hearing. This is just based off of what I am perceiving on my end. However, even with that slight bass boost, it's not overkill, and I appreciate it a lot. It seems enough to give the bass maybe a little bit of life, a little bit of fun to it, but not necessarily to be complete overkill. And I'm glad they didn't choose to go that route with this, because I feel like a lot of not only IEMs, but in-ear headphones in general tend to go a little bit overkill on the bass response. And they really seem to stray away from this and give you a very clean, very respectable bass, although slightly enhanced. And overall, I would just describe the bass as being a little bit emphasized without being unnatural. Now the mid-range on this is a slightly forward mid-range. It does have this property of being both a little bit sweet and a little bit sharp at the same time, depending on the vocalist that you tend to be listening to. And now vocals for an IEM are not particularly intimate, which was kind of surprising to me, because generally, when you're dealing with something in your ear, you get these very, very pinpoint accurate kind of center image for your vocals. And this felt a little bit wider, and that was kind of a stark contrast to what I'm used to hearing, and that was pretty pleasant to listen to as well. There was a slight vocal recession though in certain areas. Males in particular seemed to be a tiny bit thin, especially in comparison to the female end of things. And even though it does have good bass response when it came to the lower mid-range, I felt that that was a little bit lacking and lacked any sort of or form of being assertive with that lower mid-range. It didn't really seem to be particularly like punchy or anything like that when it came to that lower mid-range. Now females kind of had the opposite issue where they seemed almost a bit over amplified in a sense, almost like conical, and by conical I mean like almost as if they were coming through like a horn, so to speak. And I'm being really kind of over dramatic here, but it doesn't quite sound like it's coming through a horn, but you get this really amplified effect, and they seem overly aggressive and overly forward on the female end of things, especially in comparison to the male side. And something that the females definitely had was this large amount of depth to them. And I found that particular category also lacking on the males. Neither performance was particularly poor though. And like I said, I am being fairly critical of this headphone because it does cost $300. Now I did find myself actually enjoying the vocals on this headphone. It was just under critical analysis where I felt that these were perhaps a tiny bit lacking. Okay, now onto the treble, and I found the treble to be an odd kind of treble performance here because there's a slight recession here. Now, to be fair, I do prefer a slight recession in treble rather than an overabundance or a sharpness or a brightness or some sort of fatiguing factor of treble. I do prefer recession to that, but a recession is recession, and non-perfect performance or non-$300 performance is non-$300 performance. And I don't feel like this quite holds up to the standard. Now, I felt that the treble was kind of interesting, not only for the recession, but the stark contrast it had with the kind of incredible amount of what I kind of call, micro detail. And the micro detail is just incredible. Like the amount of information that is in the song and the nuances that you can pick up from not only just the vocalist, but instruments, the room, the acoustics within that room, and especially when you're talking about large, like orchestral pieces where you have a lot going on, you have a lot of depth to the sound, you have different areas of that orchestra that are playing at different times, and you want to hear somebody's like feet shuffle over here and somebody turn a page over here or something like that. That is incredibly obvious on this headphone despite that treble recession. So it was kind of a weird thing because normally I only get those micro details on headphones like the DT1990s, which have this incredible amount of micro detail in them, but they also, and what I attributed it before to, was kind of the performance of the treble in there, was having the treble be so refined that you're able to get so much micro detail out of your music. And this seems to do that micro detail without having a strong treble performance or a fatiguing treble performance. So if you're somebody who's really treble sensitive, this may be an IEM that is fairly interesting to you. Okay, so what about the imaging in the soundstage? Imaging is excellent. It's very, very tight. It's very refined. It's very pinpoint accurate. However, the soundstage is relatively small. They're not extremely intimate headphones, nor extremely wide. They're kind of right in the middle, and they don't have a super strong variation for an IEM, at least from the ones that I've heard. Now, that being said, I wouldn't consider it poor either. It's just kind of middle of the road for soundstage and a pretty solid performance in terms of imaging and tightness. So I'm gonna rate the overall sound to be an 8 out of 10. There are areas that I do like a lot about it for what I would consider to be like pleasure listening rather than more analytical listening. But it does have its flaws. Overall, a good performance, but there are a few caveats, and I'll kind of recap that when I come to the conclusion. So if the sound of this sounds interesting to you, what can you expect in terms of build and power for this guy? It is a plastic build, although an odd shape, and it is meant to be, like in the name, it's meant to be universal. It's meant to fit many ears. I only had 2 people to test it on, me and my girlfriend, and she didn't have any issues with it. I didn't have any issues with it. I personally did find it quite comfortable, although I did notice that when you put it in, I felt like I kept having to push kind of the top to angle it a little bit more inwards and tilt it in. And I felt that that not only gave me better sonic performance, but that also helped with the comfort a little bit. So I had to tilt them a little bit more upwards. Regarding the cable, the piece that fits over your ear is nice, but the cable, and it's the only cable it does come with, and it does have, I'm not sure if it's a completely proprietary connector, but I haven't seen too many use this connector. And the cable does feel a little bit cheap. It does feel a little bit flimsy, and it does keep kinks a little bit, which is a little bit disappointing. Terminates to a 3.5 millimeter, 3 poles, so there's no microphone on here. I wouldn't say that the cable would last forever, but it doesn't seem particularly poor in terms of build quality. Just in terms of like the feeling of it, and the fact that it tangles really easily means that I don't really like this cable that much. It does come with different tips and a carry case, and those are kind of the accessories that you get in this really small box here. In terms of efficiency for this headphone and what you need to power it, it's a 10 ohm headphone with a sensitivity level of 109 decibels, so it is really, really easy to drive. And actually, while I was on my iPhone, I only had to turn it up about 2 notches above the middle for it to sound what I would consider to be loud. And I could never, ever, even on quiet songs, push it up to all the way or full tilt. So they're very, very efficient. You don't need an amplifier to drive them at all. They will work with anything. And even going to an amplifier like the 1-amp, I really didn't see much benefit with doing that. Now, one extra little bit of information before I get to my conclusion. I do want to talk about how these sounded out of the box. These sounded very, very stiff out of the box. They didn't really have much kind of dynamic range to them. The treble was a little bit brighter and the bass was a little bit lacking. And then literally probably 2 or 3 hours, they really relaxed and very, very good sounding. And it was something that I went from not liking at all and kind of being a little bit repulsed by, to be honest, and then going into something I was like, okay, this is very nice. And it was a pretty stark contrast over a 2 to 3 hour period. So if you get these and you don't like the sound right away, just leave them playing for like maybe 4 or 5 hours just to make sure, and then try them again and you may change your mind. So my conclusion for this headphone, overall, I'm gonna give this about an 8 out of 10. I think it's a little pricey. The cable, I wish it would have come with perhaps different variable cables, or at least a better cable if you're only gonna provide one. The tips are nice. I did use the smallest variation on my ears, but I, as you can see, have small ears. And the sound quality, I kind of have an issue with the terminology that they choose to use with this headphone of IEM. This, in my opinion, is not a headphone that you would use for monitoring. To me, it's not a super technical, super analytical headphone. This is a headphone that I would more use for enjoyment. If you want kind of a slightly boosted mid-range, good bass performance, and maybe a slight reduction in the treble, this might be the way to go. But if that's not your cup of tea, then I might look somewhere else. So overall, like I said, it's gonna be an 8 out of 10. Do I recommend this headphone? Yes. Are there a couple caveats? Yes. Does it do certain things really, really well? Yes, it does. It's a fun headphone. And that's pretty much where I'm gonna leave it. All right, guys, if you like this video and you wanna consider supporting me, please consider Patreon. If you do support what I do, you can check out these headphones down below at the Massdrop link down there. And then also you can check out any of my other recommended headphones in that Amazon link down there as well. Hit that subscribe button, the like button, you know the drill. And if you like this video and you want to see more of my face and more products that you might be interested in, click one of these 2 links over here and that will get you to one of those really interesting videos that I've already done. All right, guys, thank you very much. Peace.